After 25 years of building my technology empire from nothing, my ex-wife's new husband thought he could claim a piece of my life's work. What he didn't know was that my lawyer had been preparing for this moment all along. Here's how. We made sure justice was served. Marcus Theron stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the Seattle skyline fade into dusk. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The view had cost him millions, but it served as a daily reminder of how far he'd come from the garage where he'd started his first company. His reflection in the glass showed a man in his early 50s, distinguished grey, threading through his dark hair, evidence of decades spent building one of the West Coast's most successful tech consulting firms. The last rays of sunlight caught the subtle lines around his eyes, each one earned through countless sleepless nights and risky decisions that had paid off against all odds. The gentle hum of his office door opening pulled his attention from the cityscape. Mr. Theron, his assistant Sarah's voice carried a note of hesitation he rarely heard in the decade she'd worked for him. The papers you asked for. They've arrived from the courthouse. Marcus turned, taking in Sarah's concerned expression, as she placed a thick manila envelope on his custom-built walnut desk. Another reminder of his journey, crafted from the same wood as the workbench where he'd assembled his first prototype. He knew what the envelope contained, the latest demand from Richard Sterling, his ex-wife Amanda's new husband, a man who'd spent the last 6 months trying to claim a stake in everything Marcus had built. Also, Sarah added, her voice dropping slightly, Ms. Sterling. I mean, Mrs. Sterling Wilson is in the lobby with Mr. Sterling. She's demanding to see you, says it's about Jamie's trust fund. Marcus felt his jaw tighten at the mention of his daughter's name. Jamie, who'd sided with her mother during the divorce, who'd barely spoken to him in the 2 years since, was now being used as leverage in Richard's latest scheme. He glanced at the framed photo on his desk. Jamie at her high school graduation, still smiling at him with genuine affection, before Amanda had convinced her that her father's dedication to building his company had somehow been a betrayal of their family. The intercom buzzed. Dad? Jamie's voice filled the office, carrying that familiar tone of practiced innocence that reminded him so much of her mother. We need to talk about what Richard's lawyers found, about the company's early funding. Marcus caught his reflection, again in the window. Behind him, the empire he'd built stretched across the city. The tech campus in South Lake Union, the research facilities in Bellevue, the innovation centers that had transformed Seattle's technological landscape. Everything he'd created from nothing, everything Richard Sterling now thought he deserved a piece of. Through the glass, he could see the old warehouse district where he'd spent his first years in business, working 18-hour days while Amanda complained about their modest apartment, and Jamie grew up watching her father chase a dream that had seemed impossible to everyone except him. Now, 25 years later, that same warehouse district had been transformed by the tech boom he'd helped create, property values skyrocketing just like his company's stock. But what Richard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Marcus's lawyer David Zhang hadn't spent 30 years at the top of corporate law without learning how to protect his clients. They were about to learn that trying to claim a share of Marcus Theron's estate would be the biggest mistake of their lives. Send them up, Sarah, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the calm of a man who knew exactly what was coming next. It's time they learned about the inheritance clause. Sarah hesitated at the door. Should I call Mr. Zhang? He'll be here in 20 minutes, Marcus replied, allowing himself a small smile. He's been waiting for this moment as long as I have. As Sarah left, Marcus opened the manila envelope, scanning the latest legal filing. Richard Sterling's demands had grown more audacious with each passing month. First, it had been claims about Amanda's contributions to the company's early years. The dinners she'd hosted for potential investors, the social connections she'd leveraged. Then came the allegations about shared assets, attempts to relitigate, the generous divorce settlement she'd already received. Now, Richard was claiming that Amanda's emotional support during the company's founding entitled her, and by extension him, to a significant portion of Marcus's technology empire. Marcus picked up the graduation photo, remembering the day it was taken. He'd just closed a major acquisition, stepping away from the negotiations to watch his daughter accept her diploma. Amanda had been there too, already growing distant, already planning her exit, though he hadn't known it then. She'd met Richard 3 months later at a charity gala, the same gala where Marcus had announced a major expansion of his philanthropic foundation. The intercom buzzed again. "Mr. Theron?" Sarah's voice was professional, but he could hear the underlying tension. "They're on their way up, and Mrs. Sterling Wilson is wearing her fundraising smile." Marcus knew that smile well. It was the same one Amanda had worn when she'd asked for their prenuptial agreement to be adjusted 5 years into their marriage. The same one she'd used when suggesting he transfer ownership of their summer house to her for tax purposes. He'd seen through it then, just as he saw through it now. He moved to the sitting area of his office, selecting the high-backed leather chair that David had specifically recommended for meetings like this. Everything in this moment had been carefully choreographed, planned for, since the day Amanda had first mentioned Richard Sterling's name, with that particular gleam in her eye. The elevator chimed in the distance. Marcus straightened his custom-tailored jacket, a habit from his early days, when he'd worn off-the-rack suits to investor meetings, trying to look the part of a successful CEO before he'd actually become one. Now, success wasn't something he needed to pretend. It was woven into every fiber of his being, earned through years of strategic thinking and careful preparation. The sound of heels clicking against marble flooring grew closer. Marcus took a deep breath, centering himself for what was to come. Behind him, Seattle's tech district glittered in the gathering darkness, a testament to the future he'd helped build. Soon, very soon, Amanda and Richard Sterling would learn the true cost of underestimating Marcus Theron. "It's showtime," he muttered to himself, just as the office door began to open. Amanda Sterling Wilson swept into the office like she still owned it, her Louboutin heels clicking against the marble flooring she'd once insisted Marcus install during the last renovation she'd overseen. At 48, she still carried herself with the practiced grace of a woman who'd spent decades in Seattle's upper echelons, her blonde hair expertly styled to hide the first hints of grey, her designer dress carefully chosen to remind everyone of her supposed sophistication. Behind her, Richard Sterling followed with the swagger of a man who believed he'd already won. His tailored suit, likely purchased with Amanda's divorce settlement money, couldn't quite hide his nouveau riche eagerness. At 45, he was younger than both Marcus and Amanda, a fact he seemed to think gave him an edge in the boardroom. His self-satisfied smirk spoke volumes about his confidence in their latest legal maneuver. Jamie entered last, and the sight of his daughter made Marcus's heart constrict. At 22, she was the perfect blend of her parents' features, but lately he'd noticed her adopting her mother's mannerisms, the slight tilt of the head when being manipulative, the calculated way she positioned herself between opposing parties. Her Stanford business degree, which Marcus had fully funded, now seemed to be serving as ammunition against him. "Marcus," Amanda purred, using the tone that had once charmed potential investors at countless corporate events. "You're looking well. Success continues to suit you. Though it won't for much longer," Richard added with a predatory smile, making himself comfortable in one of the Italian leather chairs without waiting for an invitation. "Not once our lawyers finish presenting their findings." Marcus remained, standing, letting them sit while he maintained the higher ground, another of David Zhang's carefully choreographed power plays. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Findings about what exactly? My company's early funding? The same funding that's been audited yearly since our IPO? Oh, it's not about the audits, Amanda interjected, crossing her legs in a way that had once distracted many a business rival. It's about what happened before all that, back when we were just starting out, when we were building this dream together. The way she emphasized "we" made Marcus's jaw tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. Through the windows behind him, the last rays of sunlight painted Seattle's skyline in shades of gold and crimson, a view he'd earned through years of strategic planning and calculated risks. "Dad!" Jamie stepped forward, her voice carrying that hint of rehearsed concern that Amanda had perfected years ago. Richard's lawyers found something interesting in the original incorporation documents about Mom's role in the company's founding. Marcus watched as his daughter pulled out a tablet, her fingers dancing across the screen with practiced efficiency. He noticed she was wearing the Cartier watch he'd given her for her 20th birthday, a gift she'd once treasured, but now wore like a weapon. According to these records, Richard cut in, unable to contain his enthusiasm, Amanda was listed as a key advisor during the company's first year. Her social connections were instrumental in securing the initial round of funding. That makes her more than just your ex-wife, Marcus. It makes her an unofficial co-founder. And as her husband, Richard continued, his smile widening, I have a vested interest in ensuring her contributions are properly valued. Our lawyers estimate those early connections were worth at least 30% of the company's current market cap. Marcus allowed himself a small smile, one that made Amanda shift uneasily in her seat. She'd always been good at reading his expressions, but this one, this particular smile, was one she'd never seen before. 30%, Marcus repeated softly, moving to his desk and pressing a button on his intercom. Sarah, has Mr. Zhang arrived? He's just stepping out of the elevator, Mr. Theron. Perfect timing as always. Marcus turned back to his guests, noting how Richard's confidence had wavered slightly at the mention of David Zhang's name. The lawyer's reputation in Seattle's corporate circles was legendary, and not just for his courtroom victories. Before David joins us, Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of 25 years of calculated patience. Let me ask you something, Richard. Did Amanda tell you about the party where she made those crucial connections? The one at the Sterling Club in 1998? Amanda's perfectly maintained composure cracked just for a moment. It was subtle, a slight widening of the eyes, a quick dart of her gaze toward the door, but Marcus caught it. He'd spent years learning to read her tells. Of course she did, Richard replied, though his tone had lost some of its certainty. It was a pivotal moment for the company. Her father's connections. Her father wasn't there, Marcus interrupted quietly. In fact, Amanda wasn't even a member of the Sterling Club in 1998. She couldn't have been. They didn't accept female members until 2003. Jamie's tablet slipped slightly in her hands, but the photographs were taken at a different event 2 years later, Marcus finished, after the company had already secured its Series A funding, after I'd already built our core technology, after I'd already filed the patents that would become the foundation of our empire. The door opened, and David Zhang entered with the precise timing of a man who'd orchestrated countless corporate takedowns. At 60, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd never lost a case he'd chosen to take. His silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him an almost professorial air, until you noticed the predatory gleam in his eyes. Mr. Sterling. David nodded to Richard, his smile reminiscent of a shark who'd spotted an injured seal. I was hoping we'd meet today. I've prepared something special for this occasion." As David set his briefcase on the conference table, Marcus watched Amanda's fundraising smile fade completely. She'd seen that briefcase before, during their divorce negotiations. It had contained similarly devastating revelations then. Before. "We continue," David said, removing a thick folder with deliberate slowness. "I should mention that I've already filed a countersuit this morning. The claims are quite interesting. Attempted corporate espionage, deliberate misrepresentation of historical documents, conspiracy to commit securities fraud." Richard's face had lost its healthy glow. "Securities fraud? That's ridiculous. We simply attempted to claim ownership of pre-IPO activities that never occurred?" David raised an eyebrow. "Submitted altered documents to support those claims? The SEC takes a rather dim view of such activities, Mr. Sterling, especially when they involve a publicly traded company." Jamie had gone pale, her tablet now clutched against her chest like a shield. "Mom? What's he talking about?" But Amanda wasn't looking at her daughter. She was staring at Marcus with a mixture of fury and dawning comprehension. She'd finally realized that her ex-husband, the man she'd dismissed as predictable and boring, had been several steps ahead of them all along. "The inheritance clause," Marcus said softly, savoring the moment he'd spent years preparing for, "isn't just about Jamie's trust fund. It's about protecting everything I've built from people who think they can claim credit for other people's work, people who mistake patience for weakness, people who forgot to read the fine print." David Zhang methodically laid out document after document on the conference table, each one landing with the weight of a judge's gavel. The leather chairs that Amanda had once selected for their aesthetic appeal now seemed to be closing in around her and Richard, their Italian craftsmanship offering no comfort against the mounting evidence of their miscalculation. "Let's start with the Sterling Club allegations," David began, his voice carrying the practiced rhythm of a man who'd orchestrated countless corporate takedowns. "Not only do we have documentation proving the club's membership policies in 1998, but we also have sworn statements from 3 former board members confirming that neither Amanda nor her father held any influence there during the company's founding period." Richard's lawyer-bred confidence was evaporating with each new revelation. "That's circumstantial. Amanda's contributions were documented extensively during the divorce proceedings." David cut in, sliding another folder forward. "Every dinner, party, every social introduction, every supposed connection was evaluated and compensated for in the settlement she agreed to." He paused, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "The same settlement, I might add, that included a non-disparagement clause and a specific prohibition against making claims on future company assets." Jamie, who'd been growing increasingly pale, finally found her voice. "But Mom said she had proof. The photographs, the original documents." Marcus watched his daughter's world beginning to crack, remembering how Amanda had always been skilled at crafting convincing narratives. He'd seen Jamie falling under her mother's influence during the divorce, watching helplessly as Amanda had rewritten their family's history with the same creativity she'd apparently applied to company documents. "The photographs," David continued, pulling out a series of images, "were indeed taken at the Sterling Club. However, our forensics team has conclusively dated them to 2000, well after the company's initial success. Notice the club's redesigned logo in the background. That renovation wasn't completed until late 1999. Amanda's perfectly manicured nails dug into the leather armrests. You've been investigating us? No, Amanda, Marcus spoke quietly, moving to stand beside David. I've been protecting what I built, something I learned to do the day you suggested adjusting our prenuptial agreement. Richard's attempt at a dismissive laugh came out more like a nervous hiccup. This is just corporate intimidation. Our evidence is fabricated, David finished, removing yet another document from his briefcase. This morning, I had a fascinating conversation with Thomas Reeves. Remember him, Amanda, your father's former secretary. The color drained from Amanda's face. Marcus knew why. Thomas had been the only person who'd known about her attempts to backdate documents during the divorce. She'd thought his loyalty to her family would keep him quiet forever. Mr. Reeves was quite forthcoming, David continued, his tone almost conversational, particularly about certain requests made regarding company letterhead from the late 1990s. He kept very detailed records, including dates, times, and specific alterations requested. Jamie's tablet clattered to the floor. "Mum, what did you do?" "What I had to do," Amanda snapped, her composure finally cracking. "Your father was going to leave us with nothing but that insulting trust fund after everything I sacrificed." Sacrificed? Marcus's voice cut through the room like a steel blade. "You lived in luxury for 20 years. Your divorce settlement was worth more than most people earn in a lifetime. Jamie's trust fund could support a small country, but it wasn't enough, was it? It never is." Richard was now physically loosening his collar, his earlier bravado replaced by the sweaty panic of a man realizing he'd bet on the wrong horse. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately, reach some kind of arrangement." "The time for arrangements is over," David interrupted, removing a final document from his briefcase. "This is a copy of the complaint we filed with the SEC this morning. Notice the timestamp, exactly 1 hour after you submitted your fraudulent claims to the court." Amanda's fundraising smile had been replaced by something uglier, more desperate. "You planned this. You knew we would try to steal what isn't yours." Marcus finished. "Yes, I did. I've known since the day you met Richard at that charity gala, the way you introduced him to our business contacts, the careful questions about company history, the sudden interest in archived documents. Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" "Dad," Jamie's voice trembled, all pretense of sophisticated manipulation gone. She sounded young again, uncertain. "The trust fund, my tuition, is secure," Marcus assured her, allowing some warmth to enter his tone. "The inheritance clause protects your interests, Jamie, as long as you haven't personally engaged in any attempts to defraud the company." He paused, watching her carefully. "You haven't, have you?" Jamie's eyes darted to her mother, then back to Marcus. In that moment she looked more like the little girl who'd once sat in his office after school, doing homework while he built his empire, than the polished young woman Amanda had tried to mold her into. I just saw the documents Mum showed me. I thought," she swallowed hard, "I didn't know they were fake." David nodded, making a note in his folder. "That's fortunate, because the SEC is particularly interested in who knew what and when. Speaking of which," he turned to Richard, who had begun to develop a noticeable facial tic. "Mr. Sterling, your law firm might want to review these documents as well. Submitting falsified evidence to a federal court carries rather severe penalties." "Firm," Richard's voice cracked. I wasn't directly involved in preparing." "Richard!" Amanda's voice held equal parts fury and disbelief. "Don't you dare try to distance yourself from this. It was your idea to push for ownership stakes." Marcus watched as the facade of unity between his ex-wife and her new husband began to crumble. It was like watching a slow-motion replay of his own divorce, except this time he wasn't the one being blindsided. "Mrs. Sterling Wilson." David's voice carried a note of almost paternal disappointment. "Perhaps you'd like to explain why your fingerprints are on original documents that were supposedly locked in the Sterling Club's archives since 1998? Documents that, according to our forensics team, were printed on paper stock that wasn't manufactured until 2020. The sound of Amanda's designer heel snapping as she stood up too quickly seemed to echo through the office like a gunshot. "This is harassment. We'll fight this." "No, you won't," Marcus said softly, "because in about 30 seconds, Sarah is going to bring in today's copies of the Seattle Times and the Wall Street Journal. The business sections make for particularly interesting reading. Right on cue, Sarah entered with 2 newspapers, placing them on the conference table with precise movements. The headlines were clearly visible. Theron Tech announces major restructuring. CEO implements anti-fraud measures. SEC launches investigation into attempted corporate theft at leading tech firm. You leaked this to the press? Amanda's voice had risen an octave. Before our meeting? Actually, David interjected, checking his watch, the online versions should be going live right about now. The synchronized chiming of multiple phones filled the room as news alerts began flooding in. Richard was the first to grab his device, his face growing ashen as he scrolled through what was undoubtedly the beginning of a very public scandal. "This will ruin us," Richard whispered, his earlier confidence replaced by naked fear. "My firm, my reputation." He turned to Amanda, his voice rising with panic. "You said this was foolproof. You said he was too focused on his precious company to notice." Marcus allowed himself a moment to savor the irony. His supposed preoccupation with work, the very thing Amanda had always criticized him for, had been exactly what allowed him to see this coming. Years of analyzing market trends and anticipating competitor moves had made him exceptionally good at recognizing patterns, including those in human behavior. Notice? Marcus moved to his desk, pressing a button that lowered the office's electronic privacy blinds. The Seattle skyline disappeared behind sophisticated smart glass, leaving them in a cocoon of artificial light. "I noticed everything. Every lunch meeting with former employees, every request for historical documents, every seemingly casual question about the company's early days." David Zhang removed another stack of papers from his briefcase, spreading them across the conference table like a dealer laying out cards for a high-stakes game. "We have surveillance photos, meeting transcripts, email records, all documenting your systematic attempt to construct a fraudulent claim to Mr. Theron's company." "Surveillance?" Amanda's voice cracked. "You had us followed?" "Not you," Marcus corrected. "I had my company's interests protected. The fact that you were plotting against those interests simply meant you appeared in the documentation." He paused, letting that sink in. "Though I have to admit, meeting potential co-conspirators at the same coffee shop where we had our first date, that was either very sentimental or incredibly careless." Jamie had moved away from her mother, unconsciously shifting closer to Marcus's side of the room. "The trust fund meetings, the financial advisors Mom insisted I talk to, were actually paralegals from Richard's firm," David confirmed, sliding another document forward. "Gathering information about your father's assets under the guise of financial planning. Rather unethical behavior for a law firm of your standing." "Mr. Sterling!" Richard's face had taken on the grey pallor of a man watching his career implode in real time. "I wasn't directly involved in those meetings. That was Anderson's department." He trailed off, realizing too late that he was implicating his own partners. "Gregory Anderson." David's smile was razor-sharp. "He's been quite cooperative since we shared our evidence with your firm's ethics committee this morning. Apparently, the prospect of disbarment makes people remarkably honest." Amanda's carefully maintained composure was crumbling faster than her broken designer heel. "You had no right to investigate us like this. We're family." "We're family," Marcus corrected quietly. "You gave up that privilege when you tried to steal my life's work, when you dragged our daughter into your schemes." "I didn't drag her into anything," Amanda shot back, desperation making her voice shrill. "Jamie deserves more than some trust fund with conditions. She deserves to be protected from her mother's greed," Marcus interrupted, "to learn the value of honest work instead of manipulation." "Yes, she does deserve that." Jamie had picked up one of the surveillance photos, her hands trembling slightly. It showed Amanda and Richard meeting with a group of men, the paralegals posing as financial advisors, at an upscale restaurant. The date stamp was from 3 months ago, right when her mother had started pushing her to take more interest in her trust fund. "Mom," Jamie's voice was barely a whisper, "you said those meetings were about my future, about learning to manage my inheritance." "They were about your future," Amanda insisted, reaching for her daughter. "Everything I did was to secure your position, to make sure you had the life you deserve. By committing fraud." Marcus's voice cut through Amanda's justifications like a scalpel. "By teaching our daughter that it's acceptable to steal what others have earned. That's not securing her future, Amanda. That's destroying her character, just like you tried to destroy mine." David cleared his throat softly, checking his watch. "The SEC investigators will be arriving within the hour. They're particularly interested in the offshore accounts Mr. Sterling set up last month. The timing, right after submitting these fraudulent claims, suggests a certain premeditation." Richard's head snapped up. "How did you know about those accounts?" "The same way I knew about everything else," Marcus replied. "By being the boring, detail-oriented businessman you thought you could outsmart. While you were busy planning to steal my company, I was busy protecting it. Every step you took, every move you made, I was 3 steps ahead." Sarah's voice came through the intercom, perfectly timed as always. "Mr. Theron, the SEC team has arrived early. They're in the conference room on the 14th floor. And," she paused meaningfully, "the managing partners from Sterling and Associates are with them." Richard practically lunged for his phone, fingers fumbling as he tried to dial. Amanda grabbed his arm, her red lacquered nails digging into his expensive suit. "Don't you dare call your partners before we figure this out." "Figure this out?" Richard jerked away from her grip. "There's nothing to figure out. You said all the documents were legitimate. You said your father's connections would protect us. You said—" "She said what she always says," Marcus interrupted quietly. "Whatever she needs to say to get what she wants. Isn't that right, Amanda?" The look Amanda gave him was pure venom. "You smug, self-righteous bastard. You think you've won? You think this is over?" "Actually," David interjected, removing a final document from his briefcase, "it was over before it began. This is a copy of the original incorporation documents for Theron Technologies. Notice the notarization date, and more importantly, notice the witness signatures." Jamie leaned forward, scanning the document. "Grandpa's signature, but he died 6 months before Amanda claims he was making all those crucial introductions at the Sterling Club," Marcus finished. "Yes, another detail she probably hoped we wouldn't notice. The sound Amanda made was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. One signature doesn't prove anything. We still have nothing," David cut in smoothly. "You have nothing except a mountain of evidence proving attempted fraud, corporate espionage, and conspiracy. Evidence that's already in the hands of the CK, the Bar Association, and every major news outlet in the Pacific Northwest." Richard had given up on his phone and was now simply staring into space, likely watching his career and reputation disintegrate in his mind's eye. "My partners, my clients, will probably be very interested in the SEC's findings," Marcus noted, "particularly the parts about how you used client meetings as cover for gathering intelligence on my company. I imagine that violates quite a few ethical guidelines." Jamie had sunk into one of the leather chairs, all pretense of sophisticated manipulation forgotten. She looked young and lost, reminding Marcus painfully of the day he'd told her about the divorce. "Dad, I didn't know about any of this. I thought—" "I know what you thought," Marcus said, his tone softening as he addressed his daughter. "You thought your mother was trying to help you. That's what she does. Twists things until helping looks like hurting and lies look like love. The silence, that followed was broken only by the gentle hum of the office's climate control system and the muffled sound of Richard's increasingly frantic breathing. Amanda stood frozen, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her designer outfit, while Jamie seemed to be seeing her mother clearly for the first time in years. David Zhang began methodically organizing the evidence into separate folders, each movement deliberate and somehow threatening in its precision. "The SEC investigators will want to interview each of you separately," he announced, his tone suggesting this was a courtesy they didn't deserve. "They're particularly interested in the timeline of events leading up to today's attempted acquisition." "Attempted theft," Marcus corrected, moving to stand behind his daughter's chair. "Let's call it what it is, David. No need for corporate euphemisms anymore." The intercom buzzed again. "Mr. Theron?" Sarah's voice carried a note of satisfaction she didn't quite manage to hide. "The press has begun gathering in the lobby. Several reporters are asking for comment on the SEC investigation and the Sterling and Associates connection." Richard made a sound like a wounded animal. "The press? Already?" He turned on Amanda, his composed facade completely shattered. "You promised me this would be clean and simple. A quick legal challenge, a generous settlement offer, then we'd be set for life. Instead, he gestured wildly at the damning evidence spread across the conference table. "Oh, shut up, Richard," Amanda snapped, her own mask of sophistication cracking beyond repair. "If you hadn't been so eager to prove yourself smarter than Marcus, none of this would have happened. But no, you had to push for more, had to show everyone you could outsmart the great Marcus Theron." "Me?" Richard's voice rose an octave. "This entire scheme was your idea. Marcus is so focused on his precious company, he'll never see it coming. I know all his weaknesses. Trust me, Richard, I know exactly how to handle him." His impression of Amanda would have been amusing if the situation weren't so serious. Marcus watched their deteriorating relationship with detached interest, remembering how Amanda had once turned on him in similar fashion during their divorce. Some patterns never changed. "Mr. Sterling," David interrupted the marital meltdown, "perhaps you'd like to explain these." He slid several bank statements across the table. "Transfers from your personal account to offshore holdings, all made within days of each fraudulent document being created. The timing is suggestive." Richard's face, already pale, went almost translucent. "Those were legitimate business transactions to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands?" David raised an eyebrow. "A company coincidentally established the day after Mrs. Sterling Wilson first contacted her father's former secretary about accessing old company letterhead." Jamie had been silent, absorbing each new revelation like body blows. Now she turned to her mother, her voice barely above a whisper. "The trust fund meetings. When you insisted I ask Dad about the company's early history, you were gathering information, setting this up. I was protecting your inheritance." Amanda insisted, reaching for her daughter's hand. Jamie pulled away, as if her mother's touch might burn. "Everything I did was for you, to secure your future." "By destroying Dad's company?" Jamie's voice cracked. "By committing fraud? By dragging me into your schemes? The company should have been partly mine." Amanda's composure finally shattered completely. "I was there in the beginning. I supported him, hosted those endless business dinners, played the perfect corporate wife while he built his precious empire. And you were compensated for every dinner, every social connection, every moment of support," Marcus cut in, his voice steady. "The divorce settlement was more than generous, Amanda, but it was never about the money, was it? It was about control, about not being able to stand that I succeeded without you." The intercom buzzed yet again. "Mr. Theron, the SEC team is requesting to begin the interviews, and—" Sarah paused meaningfully. "Mr. Sterling's managing partners are asking to speak with him immediately." Richard stumbled to his feet. His earlier confidence replaced by naked panic. I need to call my lawyer. My own lawyer, not the firm's. Probably wise, David noted dryly, considering your firm's ethics committee is currently reviewing every case you've handled in the past 5 years. Standard procedure when a partner is implicated in fraud. Partner? Richard's laugh held an edge of hysteria. After this, I'll be lucky if they let me keep my law license. My career is over. My reputation, your reputation. Amanda's voice could have cut glass. What about my reputation, my standing in the community, Your reputation was built on lies, Marcus interrupted quietly. Just like this scheme was built on lies. The only difference is, this time you didn't get away with it. Jamie stood, abruptly, moving away from both her mother and Richard. Dad, I need to know. The inheritance clause you mentioned. What exactly does it say? Marcus exchanged a glance with David, who nodded and removed a final document from his briefcase. The clause is quite specific, the lawyer explained, handing the paper to Jamie. Your trust fund and inheritance are secure, provided you weren't knowingly involved in any attempts to defraud the company or its shareholders. And was I? Jamie's voice trembled slightly. Knowingly involved? No, Marcus answered, watching his daughter's face carefully. Our investigation shows you were used as an unwitting pawn. Your mother kept you in the dark about the true nature of those meetings, the fabricated documents, the entire scheme. Amanda made a sound of protest, but Marcus continued, his voice hardening. However, this is your one free pass, Jamie. Your mother's influence nearly cost you everything. The next time— There won't be a next time, Jamie interrupted, straightening her shoulders in a way that reminded Marcus of himself. I don't want any part of this. Not the fraud, not the manipulation, not the lies. The sound of elevator doors opening down the hall made Richard jump. Amanda's perfectly manicured hands clenched into fists, her rings catching the light like weapons. The SEC investigators are here, David announced unnecessarily. I should mention that cooperation at this stage could potentially mitigate some of the consequences, particularly regarding the criminal charges. Criminal charges. Richard's voice was barely a whisper now. But you said this was a civil matter. Securities fraud is a criminal offense, David reminded him pleasantly, as is conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, submitting falsified documents to federal courts, and several other charges. I'm sure the SEC team will be happy to explain in detail. Marcus watched as the reality of their situation finally sank in for both Amanda and Richard. All their scheming, all their carefully laid plans had led them not to wealth and victory, but to the prospect of criminal charges and public humiliation. Last chance, Marcus said quietly, making them all look at him. Walk out now, sign the confession and restitution agreements David has prepared, and we can handle this relatively quietly. Continue to fight and— He gestured to the window, where the privacy blinds still hid the gathering media circus below. The office door opened, revealing 2 serious-looking SEC investigators and 3 grim-faced partners from Sterling and Associates. The moment of decision had arrived. Amanda lifted her chin, defiant to the last. You think this makes you clever, Marcus? Setting us up like this? Destroying our lives? No, Amanda, Marcus replied calmly. This makes me exactly what you always accused me of being: careful, methodical, and very, very good at protecting what's mine. The next hour unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of consequences. The SEC investigators separated Amanda, Richard, and Jamie for individual interviews, each taking place on different floors of the building. Marcus watched from his office as his ex-wife was escorted to the 12th floor conference room, her broken heel forcing her to walk with an ungraceful limp that seemed fitting for the moment. David Zhang remained in Marcus's office, methodically. organizing additional documents while they waited. The managing partners from Sterling and Associates are quite eager to distance themselves from Richard, he commented, his tone carrying a hint of professional satisfaction. They're already preparing a statement condemning his actions and announcing his immediate suspension. Marcus stood at his window, the privacy blinds now raised to reveal the media circus gathering below. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking light. And Amanda's social circles, already imploding, David confirmed, sliding a tablet across the desk. Social media is quite fascinating to watch in moments like these. Several charity boards have already called about removing her name from their donor lists. The country club is convening an emergency membership review. The tablet showed a cascade of breaking news alerts. Tech titan thwarts corporate takeover attempt. Prominent lawyer implicated in fraud scheme. Society wives fall from grace. The Amanda Sterling Wilson scandal. Sarah's voice came through the intercom, maintaining her professional tone despite the chaos. Mr. Theron, the board members have all confirmed their attendance for tomorrow's emergency meeting, and Mrs. Whitman from the Symphony Board is asking how you'd like to handle the dedication of the new music hall, given the circumstances. The music hall, another of Amanda's pet projects, where she'd insisted on having her name prominently displayed alongside his in recognition of their joint contribution to the arts. Have the dedication postponed, Marcus replied. Then we'll be rebranding the space. David nodded approvingly. Speaking of branding, our PR team has prepared statements for all major stakeholders. The narrative emphasizes corporate security, protection of shareholder interests, and zero tolerance for fraud. The market is responding positively. Our stock is up 3% already. The sound of raised voices from the hallway drew their attention. Richard's interview had apparently ended, and from the sound of it, not in his favor. The door burst open, revealing the once confident lawyer now looking thoroughly defeated. Marcus? Richard's voice had lost all its previous arrogance, replaced by desperate pleading. We need to talk. Privately. There must be some way to handle this. Professionally. I believe we are handling this professionally, Marcus replied, not bothering to turn from the window. The SEC, the Bar Association, and the courts will all follow their professional procedures. Due process will be observed. Due process? Richard's laugh held a note of hysteria. This will destroy everything. My career, my reputation, your carefully constructed facade. Marcus finally turned, fixing Richard with a steady gaze. The one built on taking credit for other people's work, on manipulating relationships for personal gain. Yes, I suppose. It will destroy that. David cleared his throat softly. Mr. Sterling, I should remind you that anything you say in this room could be used against me. Richard ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, destroying its careful arrangement. What isn't being used against me? Amanda's already trying to pin everything on me. Says I pressured her, manipulated her, used her knowledge of the company for my own gain. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Ironic, isn't it? Being betrayed by someone you trusted, someone who claimed to have your best interests at heart. Before Richard could respond, Sarah's voice came through the intercom again. Mr. Theron, your daughter's interview is complete. She's asking to speak with you, alone. The look Richard gave Marcus was pure desperation. She's your daughter. Surely you don't want her involved in this scandal. Think about her future, her reputation. I am thinking about her future, Marcus cut him off. That's why I'm making sure she learns this lesson now, before she follows her mother's path any further. He nodded to David, who began gathering his documents. Send Jamie in, Sarah. As David led a protesting Richard from the office, Marcus moved to the sitting area, choosing the same chair he'd occupied during their earlier confrontation. Moments later, Jamie entered, looking younger and more vulnerable than she had in years. "Dad?" Her voice was small, reminding him of the little girl who used to run to his office after school. "The SEC investigators. They showed me everything. All the fake documents, the manipulated photos, the secret meetings." "I know." Marcus gestured for her to sit. "Your mother is very good at making lies look like truth, at making manipulation seem like love." Jamie sank into the chair across from him, her designer outfit suddenly seeming like a costume she'd outgrown. "She used me. All those trust fund meetings, the questions about company history, she was just gathering information for Richard's lawyers." "Yes. And you knew? The whole time?" Marcus leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. "I knew your mother was planning something. Her patterns haven't changed in 20 years. But I needed to know if you were actively involved or just another one of her pawns." "I feel so stupid," Jamie whispered, tears finally spilling onto her cheeks. "All those times she said you were being controlling about the trust fund, that you didn't want me to have independence. She was just setting you up, wasn't she?" "Setting us both up," Marcus corrected gently. "You for manipulation, me for theft. It's what she does, Jamie. Finds weaknesses and exploits them. My devotion to the company, your desire for her approval, they were just tools to her." The sound of another commotion in the hallway made them both look toward the door. Amanda's voice was clearly audible, her usual polish replaced by raw anger. "This is ridiculous. I demand to speak with my lawyer, my own lawyer, not these corporate puppets." Jamie flinched at her mother's voice. "What's going to happen now to Mom and Richard?" Marcus sat back, studying his daughter's face. "That depends partly on them. If they cooperate, sign the agreements David has prepared, the criminal charges might be reduced. If they fight—" He gestured to the window, where the media presence had grown even larger. "And me?" Jamie's voice trembled slightly. "The inheritance clause remains intact," Marcus assured her. "You were an unwitting participant in their scheme, but—" He held up a hand as relief flooded her face. "There are conditions going forward." "Anything," Jamie said quickly. "Just tell me what to do." "First, you'll complete your MBA. Not at Stanford, but at Washington State. Away from your mother's influence." Marcus watched his daughter carefully as he continued. "Then you'll start at the bottom of the company, learning every department, every process, no shortcuts, no special treatment." Jamie nodded, wiping away tears. "And Mom will need to face the consequences of her actions, just like Richard, just like everyone else involved in this scheme." Marcus stood, moving to his desk. "The question is, Jamie, what will you learn from those consequences?" The next 2 weeks unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of consequences, each movement bringing new revelations and repercussions. Marcus watched it all from his office, the same vantage point where he'd built his empire, now serving as a front-row seat to its successful defense. David Zhang arrived early, one morning carrying his signature briefcase and a stack of newspapers. "The fallout continues to spread," he reported, laying out the headlines across Marcus's desk. "Sterling and Associates announces complete restructuring amid fraud scandal. Society. Maven Amanda Sterling Wilson faces criminal charges. Tech titans. Ex-wife and new husband implicated in corporate espionage." "Richard's former partners have been quite thorough in their damage control," David continued, selecting another document from his briefcase. "They've approved our full audit request, hoping to prove none of their other clients were involved in similar schemes." Marcus nodded, scanning the morning's market reports. His company's stock had risen another 5% as investors responded positively to the swift handling of the attempted theft. And the SEC investigation, proceeding exactly as planned. Richard's offshore accounts proved particularly interesting. David's smile held a predatory edge. It seems our Mr. Sterling was planning to betray Amanda as well. The accounts were in his name only. The intercom buzzed softly. "Mr. Theron, Jamie's here for her meeting with HR." "Send her in," Marcus replied, watching as his daughter entered the office. Gone were the designer clothes and carefully crafted sophistication. Instead, Jamie wore a simple business suit, her former artificial polish replaced by something more genuine. "The HR director has your schedule prepared," Marcus said, gesturing to a chair. "You'll start in the mailroom next week, then rotate through each department. Every 3 months, you'll present your progress to the board." Jamie nodded, her posture straight but humble. "I understand, and, Mom, have you heard anything?" David cleared his throat delicately. "Your mother's preliminary hearing is scheduled for next week. Her lawyers are attempting to negotiate a plea deal, but given the extent of the evidence..." "She's still claiming it was all Richard's idea," Jamie said quietly. "Called me yesterday, trying to convince me to testify on her behalf. Said if I helped her, she could protect my trust fund." Marcus exchanged a glance with David. "And what did you tell her?" "That my trust fund doesn't need her protection, that I'm done with the manipulation and lies." Jamie's voice grew stronger. "I told her I'm choosing to learn from her mistakes instead of repeating them." Sarah's voice interrupted through the intercom again. "Mr. Theron, the country club board is on line 1. Something about Mrs. Sterling Wilson's lifetime membership." "Another domino falls," David murmured, making a note in his ever-present e-folder. "The social consequences are proving quite severe. Amanda's already been removed from 3 charity boards and uninvited from the summer gala circuit." Marcus waved away the call. The social fallout, while satisfying, was secondary to the more important transformation happening before him, his daughter's return to authenticity. "The Seattle Times wants to do a profile," Sarah's voice came through again. "They're calling it the technology titan who outsmarted corporate fraud. Should I have PR handle it?" "No press," Marcus replied firmly. "Let the legal proceedings speak for themselves." He turned to Jamie. "Success doesn't need to be advertised. True strength lies in quiet competence." The message wasn't lost on his daughter. It was the same lesson he'd tried to teach her years ago, before Amanda's influence had turned her toward superficial achievements and social manipulation. David's phone chimed with a message. "Richard's partners have made their decision," he announced, scanning the text. "They're dissolving his partnership and cooperating fully with the Bar Association's investigation. Several major clients have already transferred their business." "He called me too," Jamie admitted. "Wanted me to tell Dad how sorry he is, how he was manipulated by Mom, how he'll make it right if we just give him a chance." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And?" "I blocked his number." Jamie's smile was small but genuine. "I'm done being used as a pawn in other people's games." The sound of helicopter rotors drew their attention to the window. A news chopper hovered outside, trying to get footage of the ongoing drama. Marcus pressed a button, engaging the privacy glass. "Your mother's social circle is quite active with speculation," David noted, showing them his tablet. Local gossip blogs were alight with theories and accusations. Several former friends have come forward with stories of similar manipulation attempts over the years. "The thing about carefully constructed facades," Marcus observed, "is that they tend to shatter completely once the first crack appears." Sarah's voice interrupted once more. "Mr. Theron, the board members are gathering for the emergency session, and Mrs. Sterling Wilson's new lawyer is trying to reach you." "Something about a potential settlement?" Marcus shook his head. "No settlements, no deals, no compromises. The laws exist for a reason, and they'll be followed to the letter." Jamie straightened in her chair. "I'd like to make a statement at Mom's hearing, not to defend her, but to tell the truth about how she used me, manipulated me. Maybe it will help others recognize similar patterns in their own lives. David nodded approvingly. That could be quite powerful testimony, particularly coming from someone who chose integrity over manipulation. The city stretched out below them, the same view that had witnessed countless business deals and corporate maneuvers. But now it was witnessing something more valuable, the restoration of truth, the triumph of patient planning over greedy schemes. The mailroom starts at 8 a.m. sharp, Marcus told his daughter. No special treatment, no shortcuts. You'll earn every step forward. Jamie stood, smoothing her simple suit. I understand, and Dad, thank you. Not for protecting the company or stopping their scheme, but for showing me there's a better way to live. As Jamie left for her HR meeting, David began organizing his documents. The press is calling it the corporate scandal of the year. Your ex-wife's attempt to steal your company has become a cautionary tale in business schools already. Marcus turned to the window, watching the news helicopter finally give up and fly away. It's not about the company, David. It never was. It's about legacy, about showing my daughter that patient, honest work beats clever manipulation every time. The afternoon sun caught the buildings of his tech campus, making them shine like beacons of innovation and progress. Somewhere in the city, Amanda was facing the destruction of her social standing. Richard was watching his legal career implode, and their co-conspirators were scrambling to save themselves. But here, in his office, Marcus Theron had already won, something far more valuable than money or revenge. He'd won back his daughter's soul. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same spot where this story began, watching Seattle's skyline painted in the colors of sunset. But now the view represented something different, not just the empire he'd built, but the legacy he'd protected for the right reasons. The door opened quietly as David Zhang entered, carrying the morning's papers and a thick folder. The verdicts are in, he announced, laying out the headlines. Sterling Wilson fraud, case ends in guilty pleas. Former society queen faces 3 years in federal prison. Disgraced lawyer, Richard Sterling disbarred. Theron Technologies announces record profits. Amid governance reforms, Amanda's lawyers fought hard for house arrest. David continued, opening his folder. But Jamie's testimony about the systematic manipulation proved decisive. The judge was particularly impressed by her courage in coming forward. Marcus nodded, remembering his daughter's composed demeanor on the witness stand. She'd spoken with a clarity and honesty that reminded him of himself, describing years of manipulation without anger or vindictiveness. Just plain truth. Richard's plea deal was less favorable, David added, selecting another document. 5 years in federal prison, permanent disbarment, and full restitution of all legal fees related to the fraudulent claims. His former partners are still doing damage control. Sarah's voice came through the intercom. Mr. Theron, Jamie's here with her quarterly department rotation report. The door opened again, revealing Jamie in her standard business attire, practical, professional, and completely her own. Gone were the designer labels and artificial sophistication her mother had insisted upon. In their place was something more valuable, authentic confidence. The mailroom supervisor's evaluation, Jamie said, placing a folder on his desk, followed by customer service, accounting, and preliminary product development observations, everything documented and verified by department heads. Marcus picked up the folder, noting the detailed analysis and thoughtful recommendations. You've been busy. I had a lot to learn, Jamie replied with a small smile. Still do. But at least now I'm learning the right things, the right way. David's phone buzzed with a message. Amanda's social secretary just released a statement. She's claiming the prison sentence is an opportunity for reflection and personal growth. Mum's final attempt at spinning the situation, Jamie observed, her tone more resigned than bitter. She called last week, you know. Said she's writing a book about surviving betrayal and finding redemption. Marcus raised an eyebrow. redemption. Apparently, she's the victim in all this. Jamie's laugh held no humor. Manipulated by Richard, persecuted by the justice system, misunderstood by society. The same old patterns, just with a new audience. Sarah's voice interrupted again. Mr. Theron, the Wall Street Journal is requesting a comment on the company's new corporate governance standards. They're calling them the Theron Protocols. Apparently, other tech firms are adopting similar measures. Send them to PR, Marcus replied. They can explain how transparent leadership beats clever manipulation every time. David began organizing his ever-present documents. The financial impact has been remarkably positive. Your stock is up 25% since the scandal broke. Investors appreciate a CEO who protects shareholder interests so thoroughly. It wasn't about the money, Marcus said quietly, moving to stand beside his daughter. It was about teaching the right lessons, protecting the right things. Jamie nodded, understanding. I found Mom's old files yesterday while rotating through records management. All those charity galas she organized, the social connections she cultivated, everything was documented like military strategy. Every friendship was a tactical move, every social event a battlefield to be conquered. Your mother always saw relationships as transactions, Marcus observed. People were either assets to be acquired or obstacles to be removed. It took me years to understand that about her. The intercom buzzed one final time. Mr. Theron, the board members are asking about Jamie's next quarterly presentation. They were particularly impressed with her analysis of customer service inefficiencies. Marcus looked at his daughter proudly. Tell them she'll present when she's completed her full rotation. No shortcuts, no special treatment. Speaking of special treatment, David interjected, checking his messages. Richard's former partners have finished their internal audit. 3 other lawyers have been dismissed for similar, if smaller, schemes. Your case exposed quite a few rot spots in Seattle's corporate law community. Jamie moved to the window, looking out at the tech campus below. I used to think all this was just about money and power, she said softly. That's what Mom always said, that you were obsessed with building your empire, that you cared more about the company than family. And now, Marcus asked, standing beside her, now I understand it was about building something that matters, something real. She turned to face him. The company isn't just about profit, it's about innovation, creation, providing real value. All the things Mom and Richard couldn't understand because they were too busy trying to take instead of build. David's phone chimed again. The SEC has finished their broader investigation. Several of Richard's other clients are facing similar charges. Apparently your case opened quite a few doors. More dominoes falling, Marcus noted. Sometimes one act of justice leads to many others. Jamie straightened her shoulders, a gesture that reminded Marcus of himself. My next rotation is through legal compliance. I want to help develop those new corporate governance standards, make sure no one else can do what Mom and Richard tried to do. Marcus smiled, recognizing the same dedication to building rather than taking that had driven him all these years. One step at a time. Learn every department, understand every process. Real knowledge can't be manipulated or stolen. It has to be earned. The setting sun caught the windows of his tech campus, making them shine like mirrors, reflecting truth rather than illusion. Somewhere in a federal prison, Amanda was probably still plotting, still scheming, still believing in the power of manipulation over merit. Richard was facing his own consequences, his carefully constructed legal career now as broken as Amanda's social standing. But here, in this office where it had all begun, something new was being built. Not just a corporate empire protected by careful planning and legal foresight, but a legacy of integrity passed from father to daughter. Sarah's final message of the day came through. Mr. Theron, the mailroom needs Jamie's sign-off on tomorrow's procedures before they close. Back to work, Jamie said with a genuine smile, gathering her reports. The mailroom waits for no one, not even the CEO's daughter. As Jamie left to attend to her duties, Marcus turned to David. You know, when we first started planning for Amanda's inevitable power play, I never expected the real victory would be this. Getting your daughter back? David gathered his briefcase, understanding as always. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's showing others a better way to live. Marcus watched the city lights begin to twinkle on, each one representing a story, a choice, a consequence. He'd protected his company, yes, but more importantly, he'd protected something far more valuable. The truth about success, about integrity, about building rather than taking. The inheritance clause had done its job, but not in the way Amanda and Richard had feared. It hadn't just protected wealth or assets. It had protected principles, values, the things that really mattered in building a legacy worth having. In the end, Marcus Theron hadn't just outsmarted a corporate takeover attempt. He'd shown his daughter and the world that patient, honest work would always triumph over clever manipulation. That was a lesson worth all the careful planning, all the quiet preparation, all the years of waiting for the right moment to let justice take its course. That was a legacy worth protecting. 1 year after the verdict, Marcus sat in the main auditorium of Theron Technologies' new Innovation Center, watching his daughter deliver her first major presentation to the board. Jamie stood confidently at the podium. Her presentation focused on implementing new security protocols across all departments, protocols she'd helped develop during her rotation through every level of the company. The Theron protocols aren't just about preventing fraud, Jamie explained, her voice carrying the same quiet authority her father had become known for. They're about fostering a corporate culture where integrity isn't just encouraged, it's required. From his seat beside Marcus, David Zhang nodded approvingly. She's come a long way from those trust fund meetings, he murmured, making notes in his ever-present folder. The board members are impressed. They weren't the only ones. The auditorium was packed with representatives from other tech companies, all eager to learn from what was now being called the Theron standard in corporate governance. The attempted theft of Marcus's company had exposed vulnerabilities throughout the industry, leading to a complete overhaul of how tech firms protected their assets. Last quarter alone, Jamie continued, advancing her slides, 17 companies adopted our verification protocols. 3 attempted corporate espionage cases were prevented before they could progress, and employee reporting of potential security breaches has increased by 200%. Marcus watched his daughter field questions from the audience with precision and honesty. No manipulation, no artificial charm, just straight facts and clear expertise. It was everything Amanda's influence could have destroyed. Speaking of Amanda, David passed Marcus a tablet with the latest updates. His ex-wife's prison redemption story hadn't quite gone as planned. Her attempt to publish a tell-all book had backfired when fact-checkers discovered even more manipulations in her manuscript. The publisher's lawsuit was just the latest in a string of legal consequences. Richard's appeal was denied, David whispered as Jamie moved to her next point. His former partners found evidence of similar schemes dating back years. The Bar Association is using his case as a warning to other lawyers. The presentation concluded to genuine applause. As the audience began networking in small groups, Jamie made her way to where Marcus and David sat. The Singapore team is interested in implementing the protocols across their entire Asia-Pacific division, she reported, her excitement tempered by professional restraint. They've invited me to present at their regional conference next month. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's a significant opportunity, which is why I'll be starting with their mailroom first, Jamie smiled. Can't recommend protocols for a system you don't understand from the ground up, Sarah appeared with a stack of messages. Mr. Theron, the Harvard Business Review wants to interview you both about corporate governance reform. And she hesitated. Mrs. Sterling Wilson's new lawyer called again. Something about a reduced sentence in exchange for corporate consulting on fraud prevention. Still trying to profit from her own crimes, David observed dryly. Some patterns never change. Actually, Jamie interjected, Mum's patterns have changed. They've gotten more desperate. She sent me a letter last week claiming she's seen the light about corporate responsibility, wants to turn her experience into a consulting career once she's released. Marcus shook his head. Your mother never understood the difference between appearing trustworthy and being trustworthy. The afternoon sun streamed through the auditorium's windows, highlighting the Integrity Through Innovation banner that had become Theron Technologies. New slogan. Below, in the main courtyard, employees from every department mingled during their lunch break. The rigid hierarchies of the past replaced by a more collaborative, transparent culture. The SEC's final report came in, David announced, producing another document from his briefcase. They're recommending our governance model as an industry standard. Several congressional committees have expressed interest in learning more. Jamie's tablet chimed with a news alert. Richard's former firm is dissolving completely. Too many clients lost faith after the scandal exposed their internal practices. 3 more partners were just indicted on similar charges. The domino effect continues, Marcus noted. One act of justice leading to many others. Sarah returned with more messages. The Business Leadership Council wants you both to keynote their annual conference. Theme is Building Trust in Corporate America. Also, the prison warden sent notice. Mrs. Sterling Wilson's email privileges have been revoked after she tried to contact potential investors using the prison library. Computer. Mom never could resist an audience, Jamie sighed. Even now she's looking for the next group of people to manipulate, the next scheme to run. The difference is, Marcus stood, straightening his jacket, now people know what to look for. Your testimony didn't just help convict her, it helped others recognize similar patterns in their own organizations. The auditorium had nearly emptied, leaving the 3 of them in the quiet space where Jamie had just proved how far she'd come from the manipulated daughter Amanda had tried to create. The mailroom supervisor sent up your final evaluation. Marcus told his daughter. Said you're the first executive trainee who ever bothered to learn everyone's name, who took time to understand their challenges and contributions. Jamie smiled, remembering her first days sorting mail and learning the most basic levels of the company's operations. They're the foundation everything else is built on. Mom and Richard never understood that. They thought success was about who you could use, not what you could build. David's phone buzzed with another update. Speaking of building, the tech campus expansion plans are ready for review. The new security training center will be completed ahead of schedule. Training center, Jamie looked up from her notes. Where we'll teach other companies how to protect themselves from people like your mother and Richard, Marcus explained. Turn our experience into something positive for the whole industry. Sarah appeared one final time. Mr. Theron, the Wall Street Journal is doing a feature on corporate reform. They're calling it the Theron Effect, how one company's stand against fraud changed corporate America. Jamie gathered her presentation materials, her movements efficient and purposeful. I should get back to work. The Singapore team wants detailed protocols by next week, and I still need to review the shipping department's security upgrades. As his daughter left to continue building on the foundation of integrity she'd chosen over manipulation, Marcus turned to David. When we planned for Amanda's inevitable move against the company, I never imagined it would lead to all this. Sometimes, David replied, gathering his documents, the best defense against darkness is to bring everything into the light. Your ex-wife wanted power through manipulation. Instead, She sparked a revolution in corporate transparency. The afternoon. Sun caught the glass walls of the Innovation Center, making them shine with the same clarity Marcus had insisted on in every aspect of his company's operations. Somewhere in a federal prison, Amanda was still plotting, still scheming, still believing in the power of manipulation. But her greatest manipulation had backfired spectacularly. Instead of destroying Marcus's legacy, she'd helped make it stronger than ever. And Jamie... Marcus watched his daughter stop to chat with a mailroom clerk on her way out, treating the young man with the same respect she showed board members. She hadn't just learned about corporate operations during her rotations through every department. She'd learned the most valuable lesson of all, that true success comes from building people up, not tearing them down. That was the real Theron protocol, and it was changing much more than just one company. 18 months after Amanda Sterling Wilson and Richard Sterling's conviction, Marcus Theron stood in his expanded office suite at the newly renamed Theron Innovation Campus. The Seattle skyline had changed in the past year and a half. New buildings, new companies, new standards of corporate governance that his case had helped inspire. "The final numbers are in," David Zhang announced, entering with his signature, briefcase, and a stack of financial reports. The Theron protocols have been adopted by over 200 major corporations worldwide. Attempted corporate fraud cases are down 40% in companies using our systems. Marcus nodded, reviewing the data on his tablet. "And the training center?" "Booked solid for the next year," David confirmed. "CEOs from 3 continents are waiting for spots. Your daughter's presentation on building trust from the mailroom up has become required viewing in business schools." Sarah's familiar voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Theron, the prison warden sent the quarterly update on Mrs. Sterling Wilson, and you might want to see this." David was already pulling out a document. Amanda's latest scheme didn't quite work out as planned. Her attempt to organize a business ethics seminar for fellow inmates was revealed to be a cover for collecting insider trading information. She's been transferred to a higher security facility. "Some people never learn," Marcus observed, though there was no satisfaction in his voice, only a tired acceptance of his ex-wife's unchangeable nature. "Richard's doing marginally better," David continued. "He's teaching basic business law. And to other inmates, of course, the irony of a disbarred lawyer teaching legal ethics hasn't been lost on anyone." The door opened as Jamie entered, carrying her own stack of reports. At 24, she'd completed her rotation through every department of the company and was now heading the newly created Corporate Integrity Division. Her transformation from manipulated daughter to respected executive had become a case study in business schools across the country. "The Singapore implementation is exceeding expectations," she reported, taking a seat. "Their security breaches are down 80%. 3 other Asian tech firms have requested our assistance." Marcus smiled, remembering how Jamie had insisted on starting with their mailroom, just as she had at home. "Your mother's latest letter arrived," he said carefully. "She's still asking about the possibility of a consulting role after her release." Jamie's expression remained professional, but her eyes hardened slightly. "Let me guess, she's learned her lesson and wants to give back to the business community?" "Almost word for word," David confirmed, "along with a detailed plan for a speaking tour about corporate redemption that would coincidentally coincide with her release date." Mum never could tell the difference between actual redemption and a profitable appearance of redemption, Jamie noted, her tone matter-of-fact, rather than bitter. Sarah buzzed in again. "Mr. Theron? The Harvard Business Review article is out. They're calling the Theron case a watershed moment in corporate governance reform." David pulled up the article on his tablet. "They've dedicated 6 pages to analyzing how one attempted corporate theft led to industry-wide changes. Your quote about integrity being the best security system is featured prominently. Speaking of security, Jamie interjected, the new board member orientation program is ready. Every candidate now goes through the same department rotations I did, starting with the mailroom. Marcus moved to the window, observing the busy campus below. Employees from all levels moved purposefully between buildings, each one now trained in the Theron protocols they'd helped develop. Richard's former firm made the news again, David announced, checking his messages. The last of the partners has finally been sentenced. The judge specifically cited our case as the catalyst that exposed their wider corruption. "And the country club?" Jamie asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Filed for bankruptcy last month," David replied. "Too many members were implicated in various corporate scandals. Apparently, your mother's social circle was quite busy over the years." Sarah's voice interrupted once more. "Mr. Theron, the SEC chairman is on line 1. They want to discuss implementing the Theron protocols as federal requirements for publicly traded companies." Marcus exchanged glances with his daughter. This was what real legacy looked like. Not just protecting a company, but changing an industry. Not just stopping one act of fraud, but preventing countless others. The Trust Fund Oversight Committee sent their annual report, David added, producing another document. They're impressed with Jamie's handling of her inheritance, particularly her decision to use part of it to fund scholarships for students studying corporate ethics. Jamie smiled slightly. "Mom always said I should use the trust fund to make a name for myself. Probably not quite what she had in mind, though." The prison psychiatrist's evaluation came in as well, David continued. "They're noting Amanda's continued resistance to accepting responsibility. She's still insisting she was the victim of circumstance." "That's Mom," Jamie sighed. "Always the hero of her own story, even when she's the villain of everyone else's." Marcus watched his daughter, confident, competent, and completely free of her mother's influence. "The real story isn't about villains or victims," he observed. "It's about choices. Every day, in every department, people choose integrity over convenience, transparency over manipulation." Sarah's final message of the day came through. "The Wall Street Journal wants to do a follow-up piece. They're calling it The Theron Legacy, How a Father-Daughter Team Revolutionized Corporate Security." Jamie gathered her reports, ready to return to her own department. "I should get back to work. The European implementation team needs their briefing documents, and I like to review everything personally." "Just like you learned in the mailroom," Marcus noted proudly. "Just like I learned from you," Jamie corrected. "That success isn't about quick schemes or clever manipulation. It's about building something real, something that lasts." As his daughter left, Marcus turned to David. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Amanda and Richard hadn't tried to steal the company. They would have found another way to self-destruct," David replied wisely. "People who build their lives on manipulation eventually run out of foundations to stand on." The setting sun painted Seattle's skyline in shades of gold and promise. Somewhere in a maximum security facility, Amanda was undoubtedly planning her next scheme, unable to understand that her greatest failure had led to her daughter's greatest success. Marcus returned to his desk, reviewing the latest implementation reports from companies adopting the Theron protocols. Each page represented another organization choosing transparency over deception, integrity over manipulation. "The inheritance clause worked," he told David, "but not in the way we originally planned. Instead of just protecting assets, it protected principles. Instead of just stopping theft, it started a revolution." "The best security systems," David observed, gathering his documents, "don't just keep bad things out. They let good things grow." As the day ended and the office lights dimmed across the campus, Marcus thought about legacy, Not the kind measured in stock prices or market caps, but the kind measured in lives changed and lessons learned. Amanda and Richard had tried to steal his company, but they'd failed to understand what really made it valuable. It wasn't the patents or the profits or even the protocols that now bore his name. It was the fundamental truth that had guided every decision, every policy, every principle. Integrity, once earned, was the one asset that could never be stolen. That was the real Theron legacy, and it would continue changing lives long after the scandal that sparked it was forgotten. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.